These physicists are exploring, how these mind-bending tunnels might actually be traversable.
Yeah.
Not just sci-fi, but like real physics.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area of research. What's particularly interesting is that they're really using these theoretical tools to model how these things might work. It's
Yeah.
not just speculation. They're really digging deep into the math.
Okay, so this isn't about spaceships zipping through galaxies yet.
No, no.
It's more about the fundamental physics that might allow it.
Exactly, yeah. And it gets really complex involving quantum mechanics and general relativity.
Oh, boy.
And some really mind-bending concepts. But don't worry, today we're going to break it down and extract the most intriguing insights.
Perfect. So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out what exactly makes a wormhole traversable, how these researchers think we might create them, and what kind of bizarre quantum effects come into play. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, the researchers start with a very basic model to help visualize this.
Okay.
Imagine taking two slices of space-time
Okay.
and connecting them to create a tunnel.
Okay.
That's your wormhole.
I like it so far.
Now, of course, gluing space-time together is highly theoretical. It's a mathematical process.
Right.
But it helps us picture how these two separate regions could be linked.
I get the analogy, but what would it actually take to, glue these slices together? What forces are we even talking about?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, and this paper dives into a couple potential methods.
Okay.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to potentially create a wormhole, let's talk about how physicists even determine if a wormhole would be traversable.
Good point. So how do they test that? Do they send tiny spaceships through?
Not quite. They use what's called a two-point function.
Okay.
Which essentially measures how well signals can travel between the two ends of the wormhole.
Okay.
It's like testing the connection's strength.
Got it. So if the signal gets through, it's traversable.
In theory, yes. But what's fascinating is what they found is that the success of that transmission actually depends on the energy of the signal itself. So their calculations show that high-energy signals, they decay rapidly.
Okay.
Basically get lost in transit.
Oh.
But low-energy signals have a much better chance of making it through.
So it's not just about whether a wormhole exists, but what kind of information or energy can actually pass through it. That raises some interesting questions about what we could potentially send through these cosmic shortcuts, assuming we could even create them.
Absolutely. And that's just one layer of complexity. To make things even more intriguing, we have to introduce another key player, which is entanglement entropy.
Okay.
And this measures how connected two quantum systems are.
Entanglement, now we're getting into the truly spooky stuff. I know it's this weird quantum phenomenon where two particles are linked no matter how far apart they are.
Right.
But how does that play into wormholes?
Well, in the context of wormholes, entanglement entropy could be a measure of how strongly connected the two ends of the wormhole are.
Okay.
And the research actually shows a fascinating correlation. A larger wormhole has higher entanglement entropy,
Okay.
meaning a stronger connection.
So are we saying that entanglement is what holds the wormhole open, like some kind of cosmic glue?
It's tempting to think of it that way, but it's more accurate to say that entanglement is a consequence of the wormhole's existence, not necessarily the cause. It's more like saying the heat from a fire is what makes the wood burn when it's actually the burning that produces the heat.
Got it. Okay, I see the distinction. But it still seems like entanglement is a pretty crucial ingredient in this whole wormhole recipe. So we've got this theoretical tunnel between 2 points in space-time, and entanglement seems to play a big role. But how do we go from a mathematical concept to actually creating a wormhole?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. And the researchers proposed two potential models, both grounded in what's called conformal field theories, or CFTs.
Okay.
Think of them as mathematical descriptions of the universe that stay consistent even if you zoom in or out.
CFTs, got it. So they're taking these CFTs and then doing what with them to create these wormholes?
Well, their first model, which they call Janus Deformation, involves taking two versions of a CFT and introducing a slight discrepancy between them.
Okay.
It's like taking two copies of a movie and making subtle changes to one of them.
Okay.
Like adjusting the color palette or speeding it up a bit.
Okay.
While the other plays normally, this creates a unique kind of interaction between them.
Interesting. So it's not about two completely different realities, but rather two slightly altered versions of the same one.
Exactly.
I'm picturing two screens, one playing a slightly distorted version of the other.
Right.
And that distortion is the key to creating the wormhole.
Exactly. That distortion is the Janus deformation. And a key takeaway here is that this model involves something called post-selection.
Okay.
Meaning it changes both the initial and final states of the system.
So it's not just about the distortion itself, but also about manipulating the timeline, choosing specific moments to connect.
Yeah.
That raises the question, Could we potentially control where and when the wormhole leads?
That's a question that physicists are still grappling with. Remember, we're in the realm of highly theoretical models here, but the idea that we might be able to manipulate the starting and ending points of these wormholes is certainly intriguing.
Definitely intriguing. Okay, so that's Model A, the Janus Deformation, with its altered realities and post-selection. What about Model B? How does that one work?
Model B, called the double trace deformation, takes a different approach. Instead of manipulating the starting and ending points, it involves directly coupling two CFTs, introducing interactions that weren't there before.
So it's like we're taking our two movie screens and not just altering the films themselves, but also adding in a new element that forces them to interact,
That's a great way to think about it.
like projecting one film's light onto the other screen.
Yeah, and this interaction makes the overall quantum state of the system impure,
Okay,
introducing a measure of disorder called entropy.
so this model is a bit messier than the first one.
You could say that, but it might also be more realistic because it reflects how things in the universe are constantly interacting with each other.
Okay.
In a way, Model A feels a bit more controlled with its post-selection,
Huh?
while Model B embraces the chaos of the universe a little more.
That's fascinating. Like, Model A is a carefully choreographed dance, while Model B is more of a free-flowing jam session. Both lead to wormholes, but through very different processes.
Exactly. And it highlights the fact that we're still in the very early stage of understanding how these theoretical wormholes might actually work. There's a lot we don't know, and exploring different models like these helps us piece together the puzzle.
Okay, so we've got these two potential models, but they still seem pretty abstract. How do we get from these theoretical frameworks to something a little more concrete, something we can visualize and understand?
That's where the beauty of theoretical physics comes in. These researchers aren't just throwing out abstract concepts, they're backing them up with rigorous mathematical models and calculations.
Okay.
But to make these complex equations more accessible, they also provide simplified examples, almost like little toy models of the universe.
Toy models. That sounds much less intimidating than diving headfirst into a sea of equations. What do these toy models look like?
For example, to illustrate the Janus deformation, they use the example of two-point function calculations on a complex plane.
Okay.
It's a way of visualizing the signal strength and traversability of the wormhole in a simplified mathematical space.
Okay, so they're taking these complex concepts and finding ways to represent them in a more visual, digestible format. What about for Model B, the double trace deformation? What's the toy model for that one?
For Model B, they use the analogy of coupled harmonic oscillators.
Okay.
Imagine two weights connected by a spring.
Okay.
They can oscillate independently, but the spring also influences their movement, coupling them together.
Right.
This helps to illustrate the interaction between the two CFTs in their model.
I'm starting to see how these toy models can help. It's like taking something as abstract as gluing space-time and finding a way to represent it with something we can all picture, weights and springs.
Exactly. It's a way of bridging the gap between the incredibly complex mass and a more intuitive understanding of the underlying physics. And what's really cool is that these toy models aren't just pretty pictures, they actually produce results that support the broader theory. For example, in the calculations with the coupled oscillators, they found that the strength of the spring directly affected the correlation between the two weights.
So the stronger the interaction, the more the weights move together, suggesting a stronger connection between the two sides of the wormhole.
Precisely. It's a tangible demonstration of how the interaction between the CFTs can influence the behavior of the system and ultimately the traversability of the wormhole.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like I'm getting a handle on this, but I know things are about to get even wilder. Our outline mentioned something about imaginary deformations. And honestly, I'm not sure my brain is ready for that.
Don't worry, it's definitely a head-scratcher, but that's what makes this research so exciting. It pushes the boundaries of what we thought was possible and forces us to rethink our understanding of the universe.
All right, bring on the weirdness. I'm ready to dive into the quantum abyss.
So we talked about two models for creating these theoretical wormholes, but the researchers don't stop there. They start exploring even more exotic possibilities, and that's where these imaginary deformations come in.
Okay, before we go any further, can we just acknowledge how wild it is that we're even discussing the possibility of manipulating space-time? I mean, this is the stuff of science fiction.
Yeah, it really is pretty mind-blowing, but that's the beauty of theoretical physics. It allows us to push the boundaries of what we think is possible
Yeah.
and explore ideas that might seem outlandish at first glance.
All right, back to these imaginary deformations. What are they exactly, and how do they relate to wormholes?
Well, remember the Janus deformation we talked about where we create a slight discrepancy between two versions of a CFT?
Right.
Well, in this case, the researchers start introducing imaginary numbers into that deformation process.
Imaginary numbers. I vaguely remember those from high school math, but how do they apply to the fabric of the universe?
Yeah, it's definitely a leap from a high school math to theoretical physics, but essentially it's like adding another dimension to our understanding of space-time.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If the regular Janus deformation is like adjusting the color or speed of our cosmic movie,
Right.
introducing imaginary numbers is like warping the screen itself,
Whoa.
bending it in ways that we can't even visualize in our everyday experience.
Okay, so we're not just tweaking the content of the movie anymore. We're messing with the very framework on which it's projected.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that, according to their calculations, it's when you introduce these imaginary numbers, these distortions, into this realm beyond our typical understanding that the wormhole becomes truly traversable.
So imaginary numbers are the key to unlocking these cosmic shortcuts. That's both bizarre and incredibly cool. But it also makes me wonder, if we're dealing with concepts that are so far beyond our normal intuition, how can we even be sure that these models are accurate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that theoretical physicists are constantly grappling with.
Yeah.
The truth is, we can't be absolutely sure, but what we can do is develop mathematical models that are consistent with our current understanding of the universe, and then explore the logical consequences of those models.
So it's a bit like building a puzzle, but we don't have the picture on the box to guide us.
Right.
We're just trying to fit the pieces together based on their shapes and patterns.
That's a great analogy. And sometimes when we fit the pieces together, they reveal something unexpected, something that challenges our assumptions and forces us to re-examine the bigger picture. And that's exactly what's happening with this research on traversable wormholes.
Okay. I'm willing to embrace the uncertainty, especially if it leads to such mind-blowing possibilities. But there's another wrinkle that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. This idea that imaginary deformations increase entropy. Didn't we say earlier that a larger wormhole already has maximum entanglement entropy? How can things get even more entangled, more disordered?
Right, that's where the distinction between regular entanglement entropy and what's called pseudo-entropy becomes important.
Okay.
In this particular case, with these non-Hermitian systems, we're dealing with pseudo-entropy, which doesn't play by the same rules as regular entropy.
Okay.
It can actually exceed the usual maximum, leading to some very strange and counterintuitive results.
Non-Hermitian systems. Pseudo-entropy? Okay, you're definitely pushing the limits of my physics vocabulary here. Can you break that down a bit for those of us who haven't spent years studying quantum mechanics?
Sure. In the simplest terms, Hermitian systems are those that obey certain rules of symmetry in quantum mechanics.
Okay.
But when we venture into the realm of non-Hermitian systems, those rules no longer apply. And that's where things start to get really interesting.
Interesting, but also a little bit terrifying. It's like suddenly realizing that the rules of the game have changed, but no one's bothered to explain the new rules.
It can definitely feel that way, but that's also what makes this research so exciting. We're venturing into uncharted territory where the familiar laws of physics might not hold sway.
Right.
And pseudo-entropy is one of those concepts that emerges in this strange new landscape. It's still a measure of disorder, but it behaves in ways that we're only beginning to understand.
So it's like we've stepped through the looking glass into a quantum wonderland, where things don't quite make sense according to our everyday logic.
Exactly. And while it might be tempting to dismiss these ideas as purely theoretical, it's important to remember that even the most abstract concepts in physics can eventually lead to real-world applications.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the mind-bending weirdness of it all, but ultimately these theories are trying to explain the fundamental nature of our universe.
Precisely. So while we might not be building wormhole-powered spaceships anytime soon, the insights we gain from this kind of research can have ripple effects across various fields, from cosmology to quantum computing.
Okay, I'm starting to feel a little less lost in the quantum weeds. So we've got these imaginary Janus deformations that increase pseudo-entropy and potentially make wormholes traversable. But what about Model B, the double trace deformation? Where do these imaginary numbers fit in there?
Actually, Model B doesn't explicitly use imaginary numbers, but it delves into equally mind-bending territory. The paper really gets deep into the specific of the double trace interaction, making sure that it doesn't completely disrupt the underlying physics of the two CFTs being connected.
So it's like a delicate surgery on space-time, connecting the interiors without ripping apart the edges.
Exactly, and one of the key findings is that this interaction is incredibly weak at high energies, which is important for ensuring that the wormhole is localized and doesn't have these unintended consequences for the rest of the universe.
That's a relief. I wouldn't want to be responsible for accidentally leaking a universe-eating wormhole.
Don't worry, these models are designed to be very careful and controlled.
Okay.
They're not about creating cosmic chaos, but rather about exploring the possibilities within the framework of our current understanding of physics.
Okay, so they're being responsible cosmic surgeons. But I have to admit, all this talk of CFTs and double trace deformations is starting to make my head spin. Is there any way to ground these concepts in something a little more tangible?
Absolutely. Remember those toy models we talked about?
Right.
Well, for Model B, the researchers use a really helpful analogy to illustrate how the double trace deformation works.
Okay.
Coupled harmonic oscillators.
Right, we talked about that earlier. It's a way to visualize the interaction between the two CFTs in a more concrete way.
Right.
But how does that translate to the bigger picture of wormholes in spacetime?
Well, in this case, the two weights represent the two CFTs, and the spring represents the double trace interaction that couples them together. By studying how these oscillators behave, we can get insights into how the interaction between the CFTs might influence the properties of the wormhole.
So it's not just a random analogy, it's a model that they're actually using to test their ideas and make predictions.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that this seemingly simple model actually produces results that are consistent with the more complex mathematical framework of the double trace deformation. For example, they found that the strength of the spring, or the strength of the interaction, directly affected the correlation between the two oscillators.
So a stronger interaction between the CFTs would correspond to a stronger connection between the two ends of the wormhole.
Precisely. And this correlation between the oscillators and the toy model gives us a tangible way to visualize how the interaction between the CFTs might influence the properties of the wormhole.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these toy models can be so powerful. They allow us to take these incredibly complex concepts and break them down into something we can picture and understand. It's like building a bridge between the abstract world of mathematics and the more intuitive world of our everyday experience.
Exactly. And that's one of the most rewarding aspects of theoretical physics, finding those bridges between the abstract and the tangible, and revealing the hidden beauty and complexity of the universe.
Well said. I'm definitely feeling more confident in navigating this quantum landscape now. But before we get too carried away with the beauty of it all, let's bring it back to the research paper. What other insights did they uncover in their exploration of Model B?
Well, one particularly intriguing aspect of their investigation involved what they called a free CFT playground.
A playground. That sounds a lot more fun than the quantum abyss we were just exploring.
It's definitely a more manageable space to work in. And within this playground, they used a specific type of field called a scalar field to represent the CFTs.
Okay, hold on, scalar fields. Can we back up a bit and explain what those are?
Sure, in the simplest terms, a scalar field is a type of field that has a value at every point in space and time.
Okay.
Think of it like a temperature map. At every location, you have a specific temperature reading.
Okay.
In this case, the scalar field represents the CFT, and its values describe the properties of that CFT at each point in space-time.
So it's like a way of mapping out the CFT across the entire playground.
Exactly, and by using two coupled scalar fields, they could simulate the double trace deformation and study how it affects the system as a whole.
So they're essentially creating a mini-universe within this playground, complete with its own set of rules and interactions, all governed by these scalar fields.
You got it. And this mini-universe, while simplified, provides valuable insights into how the double trace deformation might work in a more complex setting.
That's fascinating. It's like building a scale model of a city to test traffic flow patterns.
Exactly. It allows us to test our ideas and theories in a controlled environment before applying them to the larger, more complex system.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the power of these simplified models. They provide a kind of scaffolding that allows us to grasp these incredibly complex concepts. But I'm also curious about the specifics of their findings within this free CFT playground. What did they discover about the behavior of the double trace deformation?
Well, one of their key findings relates to the way the scalar fields interact. Remember how we talked about the coupled harmonic oscillators and how the strength of the spring affected the correlation between the two weights?
Right, that was a really helpful analogy for understanding the double trace deformation.
Well, in the free CFT playground, they found something similar happening with the scalar fields. The specific form of the double trace interaction influenced how strongly the scalar fields were coupled, and this in turn affected the overall properties of the system.
So are we saying that the strength in the interaction between the CFTs in the double trace deformation could determine the size or stability of the wormhole?
That's certainly one possibility that the researchers are exploring. The exact relationship between the interaction strength and the wormhole's properties is still an open question, but it's a very intriguing avenue for further research.
This is all so incredibly mind-bending, but also so exciting. It feels like we're on the verge of unlocking some profound secrets about the nature of space-time and the possibilities of traversing the universe. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's bring it back to the research paper. What are some of the key takeaways from their exploration of Model B?
One of the most important takeaways is that the double trace deformation offers a plausible mechanism for creating traversable wormholes within the framework of conformal field theory. And while the specifics are still being worked out, the fact that they were able to demonstrate these principles using both complex mathematical models and simplified toy models gives their findings a lot of weight.
Right? It's that combination of rigorous mathematics and intuitive analogies that makes this research so compelling. It allows us to appreciate both the complexity and the elegance of these theories.
Exactly. And another key takeaway is that the double trace deformation, unlike the Janus deformation, doesn't rely on manipulating the initial and final states of the system. It's all about introducing a specific type of interaction that alters the overall quantum state.
So Model B is less about controlling the timeline and more about shaping the dynamics of the interaction itself.
Precisely. And this distinction is important because it suggests that creating traversable wormholes might not require the same level of control over time that we initially thought. It might be more about finding the right kind of interaction to induce the desired effect.
That's a fascinating insight. It opens up a whole new set of possibilities for how we might approach the challenge of creating these cosmic shortcuts.
Absolutely, and it highlights the fact that there's still so much we don't know about the nature of space-time and the possibilities of manipulating it.
Well, it's certainly clear that we've only just scratched the surface of this topic, and as we wrap up this deep dive into traversable wormholes, I have to say I'm both exhilarated and exhausted. It's been a wild ride through some truly mind-bending concepts.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but I think it's safe to say that we've all gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and wonder of the universe. And who knows, maybe one day these seemingly impossible ideas will lead to breakthroughs that revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos.
I'm all for revolutionizing our understanding of the cosmos. But before we get too carried away with dreams of wormhole-powered spaceships, let's bring it back to the research paper one last time. What are some of the lingering questions or unresolved issues that the researchers highlight?
Well, one of the most intriguing unresolved issues is the question of how to interpret the increase in pseudo-entropy that we discussed earlier. Remember how we talked about the double trace deformation introducing disorder into the system?
Yeah.
Well, the researchers are still trying to figure out exactly what that disorder represents and what its implications might be.
So it's not just about understanding how to create these wormholes, but also about understanding the full consequences of doing so.
Exactly. And this is where theoretical physics gets really interesting. It's not just about finding solutions. It's also about asking the right questions and recognizing the limitations of our current knowledge.
Okay, so even with all the brilliant minds working on this problem, there's still a healthy dose of mystery and uncertainty.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so exciting. We're still in the early stages of exploring these ideas, and there's so much more to discover.
Well, it's certainly clear that this deep dive has left us with more questions than answers. But that's the beauty of exploring the unknown. It sparks our curiosity and inspires us to keep searching for deeper understanding.
Absolutely. And who knows what incredible discoveries await us as we continue to delve into these mysteries.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and stay curious, deep divers. Okay, so we've explored these two models for creating traversable wormholes, the Janus deformation and the double trace deformation. Both involve some seriously mind-bending physics, but it seems like the researchers are making real progress in understanding how these cosmic shortcuts might actually work.
Yeah, they are. And one thing that really struck me about this paper is they didn't just stop at the theoretical models. They actually used those models to make specific predictions about how these wormholes would behave.
Predictions. So it's not just abstract math anymore. We're talking about testable hypotheses.
Exactly. And one of the most intriguing predictions relates to the way these wormholes might affect the passage of time.
Whoa, hold on. Are we talking about time travel here?
Not exactly. It's more nuanced than that. What they found is that the passage of time might be different for someone traveling through the wormhole compared to someone outside.
So like a kind of time dilation effect, similar to what happens near a black hole.
Yeah, it's a similar concept, but with some important differences. In the case of a black hole, time dilation is caused by the intense gravitational field. But with these wormholes, the time difference would be due to the specific geometry of the wormhole itself.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So if I were to travel through one of these wormholes, time would pass differently for me than for someone standing outside.
That's the idea. Now, the exact amount of time difference would depend on the specific properties of the wormhole, like its size and shape. But the researchers were able to calculate that there would be a measurable difference.
That's incredible. So we're not just talking about a shortcut through space, but potentially a shortcut through time as well?
It's a fascinating possibility and one that opens up all sorts of questions about the nature of time and causality.
Definitely a lot to ponder there, but let's not get too lost in the philosophical implications. We still have some ground to cover on the physics side of things.
Right. And another prediction that really stood out to me is that these wormholes might not be perfectly stable.
What, you're saying they could collapse?
Yeah, it's a possibility that the researchers considered. What they found is that the stability of the wormhole depends on the balance between the forces that are holding it open and the forces that are trying to close it.
So it's like a cosmic tug of war.
Exactly. And depending on the specific conditions, one side or the other might win out.
Okay, that's a little bit unsettling. I mean, if I'm going to venture into a wormhole, I'd prefer it to be a little more, solid.
Yeah, I understand the concern, but remember, we're still in the very early stages of understanding these objects. As research progresses, we may discover ways to stabilize these wormholes and make them more suitable for travel.
Well, I'm certainly hoping that's the case, because the possibilities here are just too mind-blowing to ignore.
They are indeed. And I think one of the most important messages to take away from this paper is that the universe is far stranger and more wondrous than we could ever have imagined.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive into traversable wormholes, I'm left with a sense of both awe and excitement. It's clear that we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible, and I can't wait to see what future research reveals.
Me neither. This is a field that's ripe for discovery, and I have a feeling we're going to be hearing a lot more about traversable wormholes in the years to come.
Well, I, for one, am ready to keep diving deeper into these mysteries. And for all you listeners out there, keep those minds open and those imaginations fired up. Because when it comes to the universe, it seems like anything is possible.